Dr. Carl Rogers, an American psychologist, once wrote, "In all candor, I must say that I believe that the humanist view will, in the long run, take precedence. I believe that Americans are, as a people, beginning to refuse to allow technology to dominate our lives. Our culture, increasingly based on the conquest of nature and the control of man, is in decline. Emerging through the ruins is the new person, highly aware, self-directing, an explorer of inner, perhaps more than outer, space, scornful of the conformity of institutions and the dogma of authority." Spoken by a man responsible for making person-centered therapies the gold standard, and he had an optimism unparalleled for his time. How correct was he? Or perhaps, how wrong? Today, we plan to gauge a similar question, so join me as we investigate technology's varying direction, what it means to be human, our relationship with technology, and how that might lead to a loss in humanity. I intend to lay the groundwork for how we can objectively define and measure the notions we plan to put on scale. I ask for patience. Although some of this knowledge may be known and ubiquitous, it is within good practice to be on the same page before moving forward. Technology can be traced over 3 million years ago in ancient Kenya, where archaeologists uncovered multiple tools fashioned as knives, hammers, and anvils predating the emergence of our own species. We have seen varying increases in productivity across multiple dimensions from communication, agriculture, abundant forms of engineering, medical breakthroughs, and warfare. Orienting wood specialties into ironworks, adopting integrated methods along the way for greater mechanisms to empower every individual. We reached points of making breakthroughs with a variety of sciences, passing the torch through innovative generations, making the human species reach new caps of intellectual progress. Since then, and prior to the digital age, technological advancements have been hailed and usually encompassed by how to make humans accomplish more with less, or augmentation. As these augmentative approaches had the full intention of enhancement and not replacement or autonomy. Since the digital age, it's changed a bit. Automation has been the drive of recent changes in the last few decades, with augmentation taking a bit of a backseat or secondary focus in most cases. Augmentation remains a focus for some industries, like assistive technology within the branch of medical sciences, primarily medical devices like hearing aids and mobile walkers. However, this is an exception. Some might say that in the case of corporate practices, further augmenting the industry increasingly automates the consumer, something I'll get into in a bit. The invention of digital personal computers only occurred about 50 years ago in the 1970s. Many people who witnessed the birth of this technology are still alive today. A decade or so later, the internet became accessible. Pandora's box was opened, and the world changed forever. Now we have enhanced communication and connectivity. We can speak to people we never imagined and translate conversations across the world through various language software. Other technologies like virtual spaces, broadcast networks, computing, AI, and AI assistant software that improve our productivity and efficiency. We have greater means of physical connection through improved methods of transportation, giving us the capability to go anywhere, anytime. We have consistent academic and scientific reach, leading to more intuitive and shareable research, better healthcare access, and various devices and instruments that either benefit or enable one of these examples, like Neuralink and other brain implants, allowing paralyzed patients a way to train poorly formed synapses in the brain, an incredible use. Things like online educational accessibility, retrieving a form of college education regardless of location, are now possible. Search engines that allow for infinite parameters of information at your fingertips through a plethora of electronic devices that draw on more convenient and self-tailored algorithms that track your patterns of interest, providing a unique and personal interface that keeps you engaged. Technology is clearly advancing. The intuitive genius of modern science is making it so. AI can be considered one of the biggest advancements so far, to the point global AI summits are held with the full intention of expressing how influential, beneficial, and even how dangerous it can become. Various experts put forward notions in summary. We will use technology to solve the problems the use of technology creates, but the new fixes will bring new issues. Every design solution creates a new design problem, an endless and false progressive cycle. Dr. Yakov Stein, Chief Technology Officer at a large data communications organization, once said, "The problem with AI and machine learning is not the sci-fi scenario of AI taking over the world and not needing inferior humans. The problem is that we are becoming more and more dependent on machines and hence more susceptible to bugs and system failures," implying that our degradation of our humanity is worthy of note on the onset of more technological reliance. Dr. Michael Rich, director of the Center on Media and Child Health at Boston Children's Hospital, once said, "Fire was a great discovery to cook our food, but we had to learn it could hurt and kill as well. Except we've achieved mastery over fire, as it shares a lot of multivalent possibilities with our current focus. However, is it possible to achieve mastery over technology? To answer that, we must answer something else. A question that has been eating at me regarding our relationship with technology. Are we advancing with it? Before I explain where we as humans stand in this relationship, I think it'd be wise to understand humans first and foremost. It's a known unknown that people use the phrase to be human. But when asked, people have a hard time defining what humanity means. If not, we often use oversimplifications for something so incredibly unique: to feel, to speak, to live. But that's synonymous to most creatures on the planet. We manifest within the nature of our environments uniquely, whether to the benefit or detriment of our potential character, such as the human condition. And what that condition implies isn't self-evident. Human being, from Latin terms, can be interpreted as earthly man's existence. It's the existence that leaves us curious. How do we exist is the question, which to the answer is an infinite number of possibilities. There are vast theories that encompass human existence, and neither are truly wrong, so I'll do my best to compile the similarities between these theories by using 3 dimensions that capture humanity: sociability, consciousness, and existence. Consider it a conceptual model of humanity. Before we get to all the data and analysis, with what you have seen personally, do you believe we have increased or decreased along the dimensions of this model relative to perhaps a younger you? Let me know in the comments. For now, let's keep going. I argue how human we are can be measured on how we act out these 3 dimensions in relation to each other. Not how articulate, to be specific, because individual intelligence would change that. How we portray these dimensions is subjective, but how much of that expression is what can indicate if we are more or less human. Naturally, antisocial criminals can be considered enacting less humanity than a mature adult with their life together, simply because that demographic isn't operating on the scale that would constitute acceptable existence morally or objectively. To be clear, this isn't a dichotomy. It's a fluid scale. Our initial constraints of where we find ourselves can always increase or decrease throughout our lives, depending on personal manifestation. What links the uniqueness that creates immeasurable methods of expression are traits. Dr. Gordon Allport, an American psychologist, was a key figure in the development of trait theory, that people could be considered an abundance of uniquely and modified characteristics, that the soul of a person is a psychological interpretation, a personality. Some more well-known humanistic approaches contributed, like Dr. Rogers' theory of personality, gauging the outcome of overlap in our congruent to incongruent selves, causing low or high self-esteem. And Dr. Abraham Maslow's theory of human motivation, which covers his model of hierarchical needs, tracking the ladder of human motives and behavior depending on deficiency needs or growth needs. Humanistic psychology operated outside the scientific method on the theory that personal growth or the pursuit of self-actualization was what it meant to be human. For freedom isn't having the ability to pursue impulse. Freedom is the ability to be free of the passions that always prioritize the primitive pursuit. Although Dr. Allport's initial interpretation contained 4,000 different structural adjectives, various experts narrowed it down to 5 as precise and encompassing categories that synonymous or expressive adjectives may fall into through considerable factor analysis that took over 50 years using the linguistics theory, or the measure and structure of language in its uniqueness that can remain unbiased. There is no father of personality. It was an accumulated work of science and philosophy that has taken nearly a century to develop. Personality, a key point and measure in this case, of what it is to be human. It isn't just our disposable thumbs, it is something rooted in not only our environmental context or the main contributor to our socialization processes as children, some of it is also rooted in genetics, our DNA, chromosomes, phenotypic and genotypic expression. Asking what's your personality is equivalent to asking what is your way of being. It's equally complicated and simple, depending on the resolution of your observation, as it can become unbelievably complex. Like an infinite combination of numbers, it's rarely ever the case that you'll get the same calculation twice, even in the studies of identical twins where duplicity has the highest chance of success, and still, we find uniqueness from person to person. The Big Five personality model is that outcome of over 50 years of factor analysis, as previously mentioned, a statistical model covering the 5 proposed traits. A trait is an element of personality and can be considered a subpersonality, as it can manifest itself in any number of ways along its dimension. We can use the Big Five as a near-to-fit measure, measuring one's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism, as it has been quite successful in its prediction of personal conduct and effect. Each trait is measured as a dimension, a frame of reference, like modes of perception, patterns of behavior, stable motivations, and systems of values. And each fall into a dichotomous scale that can mean various things. Ocean, as a collective model, is a bit poetic considering the unpredictability of human beings that is typically comparable to sailing the high seas. So to capture these dimensions, openness is how creative or explorative we may be, or risk-taking and creative. And on the lower end, perhaps how protective or how much restraint we might possess. Conscientiousness is how organized and responsible, self-led we might become. Industrialness, order, or in contrast, careless, less structured, typically idle or dissolute we might be. Extroversion is the sensitivity to positive emotion, how we fulfill ourselves through valuing internal or social fulfillment. What environments would either fulfill us or exhaust us? Agreeableness is much like a sensitivity to social input. How much compassion, empathy, how cooperative we might be, or possibly gullible, willing, and polite. And on the lower end, are we headstrong, stubborn? Are we the type to go against the grain? Or perhaps more overtly competitive. Neuroticism is like the sensitivity to negative emotion, how vulnerable we are to emotions or how influential they are for us. Maybe seeing the world as threatening, or perhaps how emotionally resilient we are on the low end of it, with proclivities to be able to handle stress. The initial measures predict how stable these traits hold across our lifespan, but the plasticity of human beings allow us to learn and shift along the dimensions that are measured. Canadian psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson puts forth, your capacity to expand your ability past the initial constraints of your biological temperament is something like the development of character or wisdom. And let's say you're an introvert by nature and you learn how to be more extroverted. Then that expands your domain of competence. If you're extroverted and you learn to be introverted, then it's the same thing. The point is, these are all key measures as to what makes us human, as these measures can interfere and intertwine with one another, creating unique expressions of each of these dimensions. It helps to orient our lives based on our initial virtues, or at least a proper footing to begin with, hence why it is information we should know or bother getting to know. This measure of personality in our life experiences in reference to the previous model of humanity would accurately predict how we would express the three dimensions of sociability, consciousness, and existence. To be clear, no specific trait is invalid. To be either introvert or extrovert are both valid. Being a little more neurotic or a little less conscientious are both valid. What must be considered is the temperament of your environmental fit. Basically, how are you going to alter that trait in a way that you find socially successful to the point you reach admirable maturity? A bit of a hypothesis for two paths to measure maturity would be something like how we integrate new information or learned experiences following shame, guilt, and or disappointment, and how we treat those we don't agree with, which would be the second path, or how we navigate conflict with other people. That's the right direction as far as I'm concerned. That's not what everyone chooses. Sometimes unfortunate circumstances condition a response that is more antisocial, and the question is often, what are you going to do about that? Well, you either allow it to integrate it as is, as a known unknown, and something you have little to no control over, or you understand it before the necessary integration, creating a stronger, more stable temperament. You would rather sort that out for yourself before someone else comes along and makes that attempt for you, which might procreate the distasteful outcomes of guilt or shame. What can be argued is that personality develops on scales of temperament and agency. There are genetic variables that may make our nature more or less likely, but the ability of those variables to express or restrict is often on the basis of environmental context, or the culture in which we develop our being. So how your personality forms is often the outcome of how your temperament and agency becomes aware or unaware to you. Not in the essence of what your personality is, but how it becomes expressed, through the repetitious nature of exposure and success and failure, and the feedback we choose to integrate will become our own unique display of humanity. Plenty of theories indicate that we don't necessarily develop new personalities later in life. We just manifest our subconscious being through life experiences, and although that may appear different to those around us, it just means we have elements of our core characteristics that weren't as pronounced. But then various events stirred that trait to be more expressive, either socially acceptable or unacceptable. It was never as simple as having isolated traits. Each trait displays its own personality of sorts, unique to the person and how it develops and expresses itself. Being human is a given, but what makes us more or less human can be argued on whether we are more or less accepted and more or less expressive along these dimensions. I believe we are seeing a new mean of humanity develop. I see the speculative nature of measuring this, but there is no single way to do so. With that being said, let's take a closer look at the brain. So the brain is a bit of an anomaly. Although we all have one, boy, are there vast distinctions, some large and some small, depending on if we're male or female and how we grew up. It is in our humanity that we develop uniquely at the cost of cortical development. We're not born galloping, hunting, surviving. We're born helpless, useless, completely vulnerable, because our priority of development isn't just survival, it's cognition. How fast can we start thinking, processing, assimilating? To avoid the vast rabbit hole that is neuroscience, we'll keep it to the key points for the sake of simplicity. So bear with me for a second. We'll mainly discuss cortical matter and its synapses and the significance of some cortical structures, emphasizing the connections and transmissions between them. As a disclaimer, these structures play vital roles in more than what we'll discuss, as well as communicate with more structures than what we'll cover. Our cortical matter, for starters, our plasticity, is incredible. White and gray matter play a vital role in processing and transmission. Areas of gray matter within the brain and central nervous system are the processors and receivers of such information. The more developed, the greater depth to what is processed, which makes up the entirety of your cerebral cortex, while also bearing significant nuclei and structures deep within the brain. White matter, typically existing between these areas, are often constituted as the neural highways in which messages transmit. The better the highway, the stronger and more efficient the messages. It's considered white matter mainly due to its myelination of axons, like coated tracks, nerve bundles to improve efficient messaging. If gray matter receives and processes, the tracks developed in white matter ensure it gets there. The prefrontal cortex is a mostly gray matter structure thought to be the personality center, the region that makes us human, and one of the last places in our brain to mature, the part of the brain that indicates we fully develop at 25 on average. It sits towards the front of our frontal lobe and is typically responsible for higher order cognitive functions like executive functions or control, planning, decision-making, and integrating worldly experiences into our personality through moment-to-moment input from our surroundings, running comparative analyses of these experiences and reacting to them. The limbic system is a series of gray matter cortical structures deep within the brain involved in every social and emotional cognition throughout our lifespan. Some experts consider the limbic system to be the most important grouping within the brain as it regulates everything we'll ever experience. And that's a key thing when discussing human behavior. It houses the amygdala or the amygdaloid bodies, as there are two, one in each hemisphere or side of our brain. It captures emotional response, forming episodic memories associating memory with emotional conditioning, emotional recognition and interpretation, theory of mind, social behavior, and behavioral responses. And the hippocampus or hippocampal formation, which is your memory formation and consolidation. Spatial navigation influences focus, imagination, and emotional reasoning, regulation, and management. To briefly cover the rest of the system, there are other structures like the hypothalamus and thalamus responsible for homeostasis, bodily regulation, and sensory relay. You have the cingulate gyrus that tracks pain perception and the error observer or structure that captures virtual inconsistencies and signals that to your brain, with some influence in memory and emotion. There's the olfactory bulb or the smell processor, and the reason why smell often triggers memory recall more effectively. And lastly, the areas responsible for reward, like the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens, which are also involved with addictions when associated with the amygdala. But we'll mainly focus on the amygdala and the hippocampus for this video. In summary, the limbic system is responsible for emotions, memory, motivations, and behavior. White matter between these gray matter structures are our neural pathways as to how they communicate and the potential in which they communicate. Not all cortical terminology needs to be remembered, but put a pin in the limbic system and brain matter, as we'll come back to that later. With an understanding of who and what we are, what practices contribute to our relationships with technology. It's clear technology has been a boon in its own light. It has provided conveniences at an alarming rate into the availability of everyone, especially amongst developed and developing countries. We can reach anyone from anywhere and travel to our heart's content. We have methods of medicinal capability that extend life and allow for the disabled to become more personally capable. Research within these fields continues to advance, and I think society is grateful for it. But as we can imagine, it is not all sunshine and rainbows. Louisa Heinrich, a futurist and consultant expert in data, says there's a gap between the rate at which technology develops and the rate at which society develops. We need to take care not to fall into that gap. It notes some experts see how far ahead technology is getting to the point where we don't understand the second and tertiary effects of its application on human behavior. Only that it makes various professions or livelihoods more convenient, easier, capable, without much thought as to what that may cause if improvements in those areas exist. If technology advances, not only does our understanding of that technology need to parallel it, but also our societal understanding of how we address and regulate such a phenomenon. The common themes that have contributed to human change by the condition of technological accessibility are consumer and industrial practices with a middle ground of cultural influence, or in other words, the personal habits of people and the intention of creators. The ways these practices are usually expressed in all age groups are through measures like screen time, digital convenience, automation, education, medical accessibility, and commute. As an example of net positive practices, nothing is wrong with people having a greater means of transportation or medical assets. I think the consumer and industry have retained positive outcomes with the expanse of personal commute and various devices that enhance disabled individuals. However, with social networking and digital convenience, you can have something like Tinder. As one of the leading dating apps, Tinder states they have reached over 55 billion matches, and on the surface that could be considered a success. It can be argued that establishing real relationships isn't the goal, being that each match is a loss of two potential customers. Well, that's bad for business. And as a consumer, if you're constantly shown the grass that might be greener on the other side, how likely is it you might just keep your options open instead of cultivating the garden you recently established? Why narrow your romantic options, you desirable person, you? Why not have a wide range of exposure instead of focus on a singular purpose? Pay attention, because this is a theme that will alarmingly repeat itself. The accessibility of casual relationships has crippled more benevolent approaches that has made a lasting impact on suitable partners. If the male side of things don't have to develop to satiate their more basic needs, why should they? The Peter Pan story is very prevalent, as according to Pew Research Center, we are experiencing the loneliest demographic demographic with 60% of men under 30 being single. Instead of genuine physical human connection, people spend far more time pursuing their needs on digital devices. This can be due to porn, dating competitiveness, the access to casual sex, fatherlessness, social media norms, feminism, and the growing success gap between men and women that is becoming more significant. As women are far more selective, men are no longer meeting the standards of women rising in success on average. Although equality continues to be achieved, the feminization of Western society has made impacts people didn't anticipate, which creates its own issue, as various surveys average to about half of women childless by circumstance report the only reason they don't have children is because they don't have a partner, with smaller percentages stating they find partners, but none that illuminates the idea of having children. Additionally, only 19% of the women stated they were happy without children, while the majority faced various forms of unhappiness and depression. It is speculative that although dating apps allow for broader reach, it has hollowed out the original depth of relationships or relational development and commitment, creating cultures of short-term pursuits. This is the possibility in behavior that is measured. So to keep the casual relationship market alive, dating apps implement predatory practices that influence more addictive involvement, flashy indications, and benefits if you haven't swiped in a while, enabling more gambling-like behavior, increasing attitudes of sexual objectification for people seeking partners. Some might argue that it's just bad people using a good thing, and there's a point there to be made, insinuating that these interventions are not what's bringing out the more primitive and mature forms of ourselves. An interesting take. Pharrell Williams, an American singer and songwriter, had this to say at the AI summit that took place in France earlier this year.
About AI, we hear mostly fears. It's going to take our jobs, it's going to take your job, it's going to take this, it's going to take that. We're worried about what it's going to do, but you have to remember who and what is going to be using it and for what reasons. Like, I think we have our fears miscasted in the wrong areas. Like, I don't think we should be fearful of what AI is going to do, because it's humans that are essentially going to be using the AI. People with good conduct or bad conduct? Are they people with great ideas, inspiration, and innovation, or is it criminals, right? I think we need to work on ourselves. If we can get ourselves in a good place, humming like an engine, then when AI really truly penetrates regular everyday society and community lives, I think it's going to be fine, because people will have the right ideas about how we use it. It's just like alcohol or a car or firearms. Believe it or not, it takes responsibility.
Saying automated technologies aren't going to displace people from their jobs is a bit out of touch, considering that's a genuine outcome in many fields happening today. But to the point of personal control, the answer is simple: be better. Or in this case, have more control or self-regulation, and everything will be fine. Be more human in our pursuits of higher reaches of consciousness, much like development in one of the dimensions of the humanity model, naturally increasing the value of our existence in the process. Except, in current society, it has become much harder to build that type of temperament. There seems to be increasing causes of superficial methods of being, let's say, an increasing priority of immediacy or dopaminergic pursuits. In short, it seems like we're losing cognitive depth, desiring shallow and safe existences. One hypothesis is that excessive technology use implications are leading to forms of death anxiety, contributing to various behavioral and societal issues within the subcultural and political landscape. Younger groups of people are far more likely to take up political activism on the premise of seeking forms of purpose through morally desirable outcomes. There is an association between privilege and political activism, with possible conditions of boredom, something I covered in a previous video, The Family Falloff. As measured by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we are already satisfying our physiological basic needs and safety, we immediately seek where we belong, an outcome only available to more privileged countries like the US. The issue here is that with the full freedom of the internet, it's not all facts and objective truths. It is also plagued with misinformation and polarizing online spaces. Dr. Daniel Berlant, author of The Human Race to the Future, wrote, "People will become more aware of attempts to manipulate them in the digital sphere. This will partially mitigate the problem. No one wants to be manipulated, and that will help free societies develop defenses against such destructive forces." I think to a certain extent this is true when referencing the shift of mood towards legacy media and traditional news networks. However, I also beg to differ. I think the definition of manipulation needs to be understood. I think people don't want to knowingly be manipulated. I think we fail to understand the human capability to coerce its own manipulation through the comforted notion of seeking confirmation biases or remaining in likeness out of fear of cognitive independence or forming your own opinion in the face of others, which leads to groupthink. People just want to belong and live existentially. However, these in-group versus out-group behaviors turn into monstrous antisocial attitudes, especially online, as online activity is equivalent to being in a physical mob. You feel safe to say what you want and insult who you want because there are no consequences, because the chance of consequences are very low. Even in historical demonstrations of human capability, like Milgram's study of obedience, if you can't see the person you're hurting, you're more likely to hurt them if they don't do what you want them to. As online platforms and communities host some of the more degenerative echo chambers that inhibit our explorative nature of the human condition, increasing values of consciousness and sociability, further reinforcing sheltered notions of likeness and respite against uncomfortable stimulus in the world, much like a deferring opinion, people develop such a weak framework of self due to this very lack of depth. An attack on their opinion becomes an attack on their identity, and it becomes harder for people with lower levels of consciousness to be able to tell the difference, keeping many people within their safe, cognitive, infantile spaces, crippling the desire to leave over time. Other experts like Dr. Bobo Gupta believe until government policies, regulators, can keep up with the speed of technology and AI, there is an inherent imbalance of power between technology's potential to contribute to social and civic innovation and its execution in being used this way. Predatory practices within social advertising landscapes on consumers, much like high-pressure sales tactics, have been just under the surface for about a decade, as none of the industrial psychological methods are considered illegal. Naturally, monopolies have been built on the established network of preying on human impulse, the latest and most successful target in industrial practices. Instant taps to find love, drugs, sex, power, validation, interest, information, conversation, even food through appetizing, attractive, or interest appeal. Hence the development of algorithms knowing just what to advertise per individual. Any basic need can be received almost immediately, making more hard-earned routes seem like a chore, a daunting continual task that isn't consistent with how the rest of your life has been conditioned. People underestimate what this kind of immediacy and availability has done to our brains, our behaviors. If we all manage a universal essence of control, well, then good. But as previously stated, we're not all the same. Our personalities express vastly differently, and some of us might fall prey to this easier than others. Someone who is higher in extroversion, neuroticism, and or openness might trip into the pitfalls that is the impulsive landscape of digital accessibility, reducing our consciousness as per the model of humanity. Another predictor of falling for these poor consumer practices are matters of the home, as children and our oversight of them have become the primary concern when measuring what technology is doing to the developing mind. It's contentious enough that parents sit their kids in front of screens as to make parenting more bearable, convenient, whether by learning devices or entertainment. However, it has transferred well into academic practices. COVID-19 demonstrated such a need and brought forth a wave of educational capability on online formats as a powerful educational tool, and many educators proceed to state that it shouldn't only be used as a response to crisis management. One might argue that this alleviates the workload of teachers in the educational system and allows for more work to be done. However, an opposing argument of convenience and lower forms of education are brought into question as studies promote that in-person classroom study is far more effective than digital or virtual classrooms. The World Economic Forum also reports that while technology can help young students learn and acquire knowledge through play, for example, evidence suggests that learning is far more effective through guidance from an active adult, such as a teacher, creating a dilemma in these virtual spaces. According to the same source, the educational technology market is projected to expand to $342 billion this year in 2025, predicting even more digital integration in K-12 school systems. Students on average state that the use of virtual classrooms and digital tools has improved their grades and test scores, while also further reinforcing comfortable environments that might play a hand in sheltered identities. These practices aren't always intended to be malicious, as propaganda, manipulation, and subliminal messaging isn't at the base of every industry's pursuit. Hopefully, it's a bit subjective to speak on a universal intention, but regardless of intention, there are effects. Now, the bottom line up front is that our relationship with technology has benefited us personally in more ways than one. It is difficult to track the themes of these benefits because what you use can often indicate its unique impacts. Much like the poor illustration and misinformation surrounding video games as having a wide range of incredible outcomes, with the falsified summary that all video games achieve these outcomes, when instead it was more cognitive, racing, and skill-based training programs that had many of these impacts, which not many actually engage in when discussing this digital hobby. However, there are measurable significant patterns in our growing relationship with technology. We are becoming far more reactive. The incorporation of digital learning devices and our exposure to quickly operating systems from business software to video games is enabling neuroplasticity within our cortical matter in a way that we are far more responsive, quicker with reaction, and develop greater expanses of what our working memory can process. As we operate faster variations of technology, our brains are growing accustomed to that response. Our brain creates new new neural connections that allow for a wider range of attention, emphasizing multitasking as the primary method of productivity. Hence why most of us multitask now, using background stimulus during ordinary tasks. But we'll return to this outcome later. The ranges of our expression and the empowerment of creativity has taken leaps and bounds with various software and AI assistant tools. AI can jot up plans and schedules that allow for greater organizational practices of employment or even financial plans that can predict greater methods of investment, attributing to more personal successes and well-being, leaving concern and focus to other areas of our lives. We have cognitive tools and access to information that allow for various brain training, productivity, and organization, leading to greater efficacies within our careers, which inherently have led to higher measures of fulfillment on the outcome of those successes. It is easier than ever to create our own platforms within the internet space. Managing success becomes a steeper climb, but the possibilities are endless. The social connectivity of communication tools like Zoom, WhatsApp, Discord, and various social media networks foster connections, reducing more top-layer versions of loneliness, linking to improvements in mental health and cognitive resilience. In most cases, some connections are better than no connection. These conveniences increase that probability. However, this is another subject we'll revisit. Dr. Ray Junko, Director of Research at the Center of Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, predicts social and civic innovation will substantially mitigate mental and emotional health problems tied to digital life. Two technologies in particular are social media and smartphones. However, both of these technologies grew out of and thrived because of the human need for connection. The quote continues to list various changes that could be made to allow these devices to achieve more catharsis, but the continuous concept remains a miss. Perhaps improving technology in these areas is not the answer. We are surely becoming more reactive and perceptually capable, but does that make us more human? We can argue that in best case scenarios of a balanced relationship, it moves us farther along the sociability and existence dimension. But is that the only pattern we've seen? Existence is also the value of being, and not everyone is being as productive when relatively compared. Perhaps replacing these social needs and motives with less fulfilling forms comes at a price. According to the World Health Organization, 60 to 85% of people from developed and developing countries currently lead sedentary lifestyles, which is highly associated with decreasing levels of posture, self-esteem, and physical fitness. Dr. Jay Geed, child psychiatrist and renowned for his studies on the adolescent brain, once said, "There remains a common feeling that there is something about the whole phenomenon that is just not natural. We did not evolve to be staring at a screen for most of our waking hours. We evolved to be interacting with each other face to face, using our sense of smell and touch and taste, not just sight and sound. It cannot be healthy to stray so far from activities for which nature has shaped our brains and our bodies." He argues that desire for digital media is in fact exquisitely aligned with the biology of the teen brain and our evolutionary heritage, with three features of adolescence being particularly relevant to this issue: hunger for human connectedness, appetite for adventure, and desire for information. The youth seems to be the concern for many, as Dr. Yakov Stein also mentions. Penmanship and mental arithmetic, which have been superseded by technical means, education is more focused on how to retrieve required information rather than remembering things, resulting not only in less actual storage, but less depth of knowledge, and the lack of ability to make connections between disparate bits of information, which is the basis of creativity. Use it or lose it, by all means, is a genuine theory of how the brain operates, indicating that engagement with technology fosters the formation of new synaptic connections while simultaneously diminishing less utilized neuronal pathways, a concept rooted in synaptic plasticity. Neuropsychological research supports the notion that extensive media exposure can alter neuronal activity patterns, affecting cognitive functions initially shaped by genetic predispositions. This exposure can enhance rapid reaction and response capabilities, but may compromise deeper cognitive processes requiring more nuanced control. Furthermore, analysis of psychological, psychiatric, and neuroimaging data demonstrates both immediate and long-term cognitive alterations, influencing attentional capacity with a shift towards multitasking at the expense of sustained focus, memory processes, and the dynamics of social cognition. The accessibility of online information reshapes how knowledge is stored, retrieved, and valued, while the landscape of social interactions has significantly evolved as a result. After a meta-analysis of over a dozen studies covering the relationship of technology use and the brain, there are two conditions that are consistent: excessive use or reliance, and early exposure. The worst outcome was when these conditions overlapped, and the age group suffering the most are 3 to 15 years of age. Adolescence can be considered one of the most important periods of brain development, mainly due to the activity during developmental processes of neuroplasticity, the emotional and social aspects undergoing intensive changes. The only age group capturing net positives are the tech naive in late adulthood, or older types that didn't grow up with the same level of digital accessibility. However, for children, it is overwhelmingly negative under these two conditions, and it carries many of these effects into adulthood. These conditions have biological and behavioral impacts that can be summarized into two main effects: brain and cognitive development, and socio-emotional skills. Emerging research using brain imaging suggests heavy screen time and technology use may thin the cortex prematurely and alter connectivity in areas tied to language, attention, and emotional processing, producing harmful effects like impaired brain development, heightened attention deficits, impaired emotional and social intelligence, social isolation, disrupted sleep, and technology addiction. However, long-term implications are still under study, as excessive use may just be limiting time for activities like reading, imaginative play, or problem solving, which are critical for developing executive functions. Let's get into some evidence and examples. Heavy screen use before age 5 is linked to slower language and cognitive development in some studies. Early exposure of digital devices for preschoolers leads to lower executive function and literacy ability due to poor microstructural integrity of white matter in the Broca and Wernicke areas of the brain, which are mainly responsible for language comprehension and speech. It also led to lower scores in behavioral measures for executive functions in the prefrontal cortex, or early signs of self-control. Extensive exposure and interaction on social media during adolescent periods can alter and reduce gray matter volume in areas like the amygdala due to poor replications of physical social networking, causing a vulnerability to emotional precedence, peer conformity, and acceptance sensitivity. The underlying effects in behavior lead to far more knee-jerk reactions and impulsive pursuits to various forms of news and information. It's a possible explanation for more radical political leanings, while also weakening the functions involved in regulating addictive behaviors. There are negative effects on human memory performance from using online cloud storage, search engines, and even frequent use of GPS when navigating to known locations. The Google effect indicates we are remembering less information and remaining less cognitively engaged because we can either store information digitally instead of cognitively, or can use internet searches to provide information instead of remembering learned forms of that same information, influencing a reduction of gray matter volume in areas like the hippocampus. Not relying on our own brain memory function decreases its future applicability, reducing our ability to memorize and recall facts in a reliable manner. As previously stated, uses of digital media, social networks, or the internet influence a multitasking emphasis on behavior. Let's investigate the other side of that coin. Prolonged screen time, especially with fast-paced content or multitasking, things like gaming or social media, can reduce attention spans and impair the ability to focus on tasks requiring sustained effort. Studies suggest overexposure to digital devices may contribute to symptoms resembling ADHD. Correct. Our relationship with technology is fostering brain-equivalent behavior to a mental disorder. ADHD is typically caused by a chemical imbalance. However, in the case of technology, it's priming our brains to behave in its likeness. It's highly likely that this explains the rise of both diagnosis and misdiagnosis of ADHD and these terrible rates of medicated children who might not even need these treatments, since equivocal cognitive function and behaviors of poor self-regulation and attention spans can be conditioned through extensive digital consumption, especially in boys. Although inadequate parenting styles and gender-neutral elementary classroom settings also play a role, as control seems to be an emphasis that's exercised poorly. Most common effects of multitasking emphasis from digital media use are developing an ability of processing multiple continuous streams of information. We expand how much we can process and decrease how well we process it. Those constantly exposed to multitask-based stimulation will retain less information during lower frequencies or become bored and lack focus during lower individual streams of information. These trickling effects strike home in educational environments, reducing the working memory capacity of children ranging from 6 to 15 years of age. Use of digital learning and screen time further influences the level of text comprehension of reading on screens, leading to reduced attentiveness, enabling attention deficits in this age group. A study in France and UK found frequent media multitasking can also contribute to diminished gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, an area of the brain where attention control predominantly exists. In addition to other effects, it negatively influences deep reading and depth engagement. Deep reading was a relatively new term, mainly used on the onset that digital interventions weren't retaining the same level of reading comprehension as physical printed material, while depth engagement is more in line with singular thought and navigation. Reducing the more intricate ability of attention and focus also reduces our ability to achieve complex thought. With extensive technology use or reliance, screen time delivers its own effect besides what the screen provides. LED implications and other blue light modules also influence memory retention negatively by an overabundance of stimulation in the occipital lobe of the brain, sparking various forms of attention and reactivity. However, it also sparks a level of arousal that suppresses areas like the prefrontal cortex. Increased strain in the occipital lobe decreases the effectiveness of other processors. This creates a high-intensity message, leading to poor regulation of the same message, while also increasing tolerance to that intensity, requiring more illuminated and constant visual stimulation to retain attention, which also leads to higher increases of behavior similar to ADHD. Additionally, these forms of light obstruct natural repetitions of circadian rhythm that influence sleep patterns and schedules. Repetitive light tells the brain that it is still time to be awake and be active, suppressing the secretion of melatonin, the sleep hormone. Naturally, less effective sleep patterns deny deep REM sleep or rapid eye movement, stages in sleep where we dream, which is necessary for processing and storing information from that day into memory. These processes build a stronger functioning brain through repetition. Denying that repetition leads to weaker pathways of developing and storing memories in the future. Reduced sleep due to rabbit hole pursuits of social media use and light exposure can also lead to psychiatric disorders, including anxiety and depression, and is associated with lower overall brain activity, which impacts productivity, physical safety, and weight management. So stop that desk scrolling. Obviously, this is a negative that's unique to screen time. So let's see what this is doing to those socio-emotional skills. Overuse of technology, particularly social media or gaming, can and have reduced face-to-face interaction, potentially hindering empathy, emotional regulation, and social cue recognition. Some studies link excessive use to increase anxiety, depression, or lower self-esteem, especially in adolescence, while other reports draw a negative correlation between digital media and lower cognitive empathy. The more you're online, the more likely you portray a malicious identity, sometimes regardless of personality. Communication via technology has stripped away nonverbal communication, leading to various forms of misunderstanding, not being able to successfully gauge feedback like humor or sarcasm as effectively, due to its substitution with in-person conversations. Additionally, this substitution leads to less influential or constructive body language, as eye contact and display of interest in conversation becomes harder to achieve in face-to-face interactions, which explains the often poorly constructed belief in false ideations that it's because most people are lower in trait extroversions or are introverts, when they simply aren't confident with communicating but would love human connection. It's also within the ignorant concept that it explains antisocial behavior, when antisocial behavior isn't hermit-like behavior, it's more criminal-like activity, like betrayal, bullying, or relational violence. It's this reduction of interaction that is highly associated with time online, as an example. This lack of physical presence and representation leads to the power of anonymity in social online spaces, creating mob-like cultures and mentalities, increasing the outcomes of cyberbullying, virtual conformity, and censorship, which are some of the highest contributing factors to the existence of polarizing and extreme echo chambers, with more likeliness of poor reaction to stress leading to development of panic attacks and nervous fixations. These indirect saboteurs of self-esteem may contribute to the pursued isolation of young men, possibly even to ideations of self-harm. Although not cause and effect, these dangerous uses of digital behaviors induce further isolation and solace to vulnerable personalities, creating spiraling effects. It might increase the belief of technological dependency or worsen the condition. Frequent use of highly stimulating content can overactivate the brain's reward system, increasing dopamine release. This may lead to compulsive use or difficulty enjoying less stimulating activities, resembling behavioral addiction, much like the dating app advertisements and gambling practices previously covered. Excessive use of technological input can flood the dopamine pathways of our brain's pleasure centers, that portion of the limbic system, deriving far less motives and reward from pursuing social pleasure or feeling social fulfillments as something worth having or engaging with, leading to possibly more reckless or destructive pursuits that often lead to things like addiction or psychopathic behaviors in order to achieve greater forms of satisfaction due to continued development of tolerance. Nomophobia is a new and unique disorder instilling an immense and continuous fear of not being close to one's phone, like a partner in dependency, or a comforting behavior to alleviate a compulsion. Addictions and phobias developed during moments of poor digital practices can lead to many of the outcomes above and might explain that although we as human beings may not develop these outcomes, we get close to it through our fall and sociability and consciousness, reducing the value of our existence. The common and current relationship with technology suggests less depth and more impulse in human cognition and behavior. We are reducing our ability to be as intimately connected at the cost of frequency and convenience. We find ourselves priming our brains for more emphasis and expression of immature qualities, virtueless pursuits, and lesser efficacy towards more in-depth learning and education. In the onset of these conditions, we are crippling our potential temperament and in most cases, reducing our measure of existence and consciousness, while increasing the frequency of sociability, but also decreasing the authenticity of it. Technology has advantages in areas that focus on transportation or medical accessibility. There are areas where unique digital programs can find success in improving neurodevelopment, but these programs are hardly used outside of medical or cognitive treatments, leading to the overall conclusion. Although technology grants its benefits in other proven areas, it does indeed seem like poor relationships with technology can and will decrease our humanity under these conditions, likely increase the misdiagnosis of mental disorders through measures of equivocal behavior, and foster environments of excessive safety and comfort in the absence of physical presences. However, it is hard to say if these patterns of excess and exposure are causing these destructive outcomes. Minus the blue light studies, obviously. Or maybe it's because it's replacing the usual activity of previous generations of children and adults during these developmental periods. In previous generations, we did more with our boredom, and there's a power in that we didn't realize. From imaginative tumbling play as children to planning out ambitions as adults, effectively using our boredom by our brains measure, not technologies. With the intervention of technology, especially digital accessibility, we fill those periods where we can find the most creativity with things that blast our senses into flow states or focus, that inhibit the previous thought patterns and pursuits. The data suggests that technology has made us less in some rather significant areas, while in some cases building the belief of destructive dependency on devices outside of our existence. Much like a person who uses a crutch who doesn't need it, but believes they do. Eventually, degrading into believing they need a wheelchair, then into believing they don't need to move at all. I find this analogy to be representative of the lack of sincere purpose found in current society of developed and developing countries. This doesn't apply to the entirety of the populace, but this does represent significance. There is enough data to suggest this is real. It does exist, and it's getting worse. I personally believe and have seen a plethora of evidence suggesting the weakening experiences of the human condition in relation to previous generations. So, what should we do? Nothing. Bow to your new digital and AI overlords. I'm joking. I do believe there are ways to improve our relationships with technology, much like how we improve the relationships with ourselves. Although technology can be something we can get lost in, we can be the driver in that seat, instead of it being what drives us. Much like our emotions or impulses, just because we feel them doesn't mean we need to enact them. Otherwise, we become the slaves of ourselves all over again. Technology itself has no real morality, only transferable defects that the user or designer may bring to the tool. First and foremost, boredom is key, and where creativity and imagination happen. It's okay to expose yourself to it. Not every second has to be occupied by some form of stimulation, and not every stimulation has to come from multiple sources. Fluctuate between both forms of receipt as to not only hone one, weakening the other. Try a good night's sleep and a continual pattern of it. Who would have thought? Besides being key to brain development, ensuring a continuous circadian rhythm is part and parcel to why brain health can remain consistent from youth to late adulthood. Be flexible enough to evolve with technology, but also being able to have the discipline to know and choose how to use it right. A spot-on notion of Dr. Rich's previous quote about the similarities between fire and technology. Families and relationships should have regular sit-down, screen-free meals. And believe it or not, there's actually a lot of data that suggests this does wonders for children. Another thing, leave your phone alone in the presence of social efforts. If you're spending time with people, then spend it with them. Phones are often used as mediums to combat silence because healthy and acceptable socializing is becoming less common. People are less confident in having a normal conversation. If you must be on your phone during social settings of friends, people you like, you might have your priorities mixed up, maybe even displaying early signs of behavioral addiction. It might say a lot about how you form relationships. Perhaps you don't know as much as you thought you did about friendships, or even worse, about your partner or yourself. Avoid blue lightish LED stuff before bed because reasons. If you have kids or siblings who enjoy video games, play those games with your children instead of forbidding it. Even if it's not your genre, learn in-loop and out-of-loop game mechanics and guide your child or loved one through what they are thinking and seeing in the game to enable the cognitions that are lying dormant through isolated play. Help yourself and others plan how to spend their time. focusing on a combination of priority or interest-based activities to ensure the avoidance of death scrolling during the onset of boredom, and filling that time with the easiest usual answer. This is something that I struggle with at times, where if I didn't have that next step for me planned out and it drops from my focus or I forget it, but really just didn't prioritize it, I'll end up grabbing my phone for a bit and stumble into that abyss, letting time pass me by before I slip back into consciousness and regain the momentum to continue. Try setting one task at a time. Avoid jumping around during the completion of this task, a good measure of possible attention deficits, as well as gauging how severe it may be. Doesn't mean you have ADHD. However, it might mean you have a brain attuned to digital media, which isn't good in terms of depth. It might be a good time to swap out some hobbies. Try taking various personality tests and be honest. It might help guide you into knowing what habits can be considered more risky or less so in your particular case. Lastly, a concept from Dr. Marianne Wolf, the director for the Center of Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice in UCLA, proposes a biliteracy form of education regarding reading. She proposes that you don't use digital platforms for children until the age of 10, after which you slowly integrate various technologies into their leisure or educational means, while teaching them to capture the same amount of information while still incorporating physical print for in-depth engagements. Do with that what you will, but that's what the experts recommend. So to close it out, I have some questions that may vary based off age group. I put forth a model of humanity. After all the data, how do you feel it applies? And what direction do you think we're going in overall? How do you feel about the depth of conversations across the wide range of media? Also, how closely do you relate to symptoms of ADHD without that diagnosis, obviously? How does it feel to know most likely where it's coming from? And if you have been diagnosed, how likely is it just your upbringing and not a molecular imbalance? Lastly, do you think this constant replacement from boredom, inhibiting our individual ability to be creative, is what's creating all these like-minded impressions lately? Anecdotal, but I personally have seen the same interests and arguments put forth and defended in the same fashion for about a decade now. Not because they understand or derive some kind of intrinsic value from what they're putting forth, but because it's on this emphasis of regurgitation, more groupthink than usual. Let me know in the comments. And final point, thank you to everyone that has subbed to the channel. We hit 1,000 subscribers recently, and that means the absolute world to me. We're moving. It's a slow burn, like I was saying, but we're moving. So thank you to everyone that has played a part so far. I'm not really sure how to go about that, so if y'all have any ideas, feel free to let me know. Additionally, I have seen people dropping support through Patreon. Yo, thank you so much for doing so, as YouTube in itself, it really provides nothing. The truth is that I don't have that quite set up yet, as that's another thing that I'm navigating. But if you're going to try to support me at all, do the bare minimum. Do the lowest amount possible, because I don't feel like I'm fulfilling my end of the bargain if I don't have those kind of systems established. That's it for now. Like or dislike, and as always, thanks again, and I'll go ahead, see you next time.